Monday morning. I'm your host, Dean Rotbart, with a very special video audio podcast this week. I have a guest who is not only highly respected, but he's somebody I personally respect a great deal. He is accomplished, but I also would like to volunteer that I consider him a friend. And not everybody who's a podcast guest is a friend, but Jon Hilsenrath is. Jon has now been covering economics for the Wall Street Journal for 25 years, and his specialty is economics and finance. He will be out November 1st. You can already go ahead. I'll give you a URL where you can pre-order, but he will be out with a biography of Janet Yellen. The title of the book is Yellen, the Trailblazing Economist Who Navigated an Era of Upheaval. It is a terrific book. Jon was nice enough to allow me a preview of the book. It's a great read if you don't care about economics, because it's a love story. It's a overcoming obstacles story. It provides interesting insight into the way our government operates. It's a women's empowerment story. There's a lot of things you wrapped into that, Jon, and congratulations. I am confident it's going to be a bestseller and a what do they call a book that is going to last for a long period of time? It's going to be a terrific book. A little bit more about Jon.
So, Dean, I think the saying is from your mouth to God's ears.
Okay, I hope so. Let's just hope so. I think so. We're gonna sell books on this week's edition of the podcast. I'm looking at Jon's official Wall Street Journal bio, and it points out a few things. He has tended to focus on the causes and consequences of economic and financial crises. You've had plenty of material to work with over the years.
Yes, unfortunately.
He's been part of a number of Pulitzer Prize-winning or nominated teams. He was a part of a team in 2014 at the Journal. Were you the finalist yourself, or were you part of a team for that?
Okay. Yeah, I was fortunate to be my own finalist on that one.
He was his own finalist in 2014 for his coverage of the Federal Reserve. I don't have the dates in front of me. I do have them. Was Janet Yellen? Was it Janet who was the Fed chair there? Was it Bernanke who was the chair?
That was the year that she was nominated by Obama, and there was a big fight in Washington over whether the job would go to Larry Summers, Barack Obama's old friend, or Janet Yellen, and in her low-key way, she won out and became the first woman ever to run the Fed.
Right. So he was a finalist for the Pulitzer for that in 2009. That's when you were part of a team for the coverage of the financial crisis. Amazing coverage. And as I wrote in my book, September 12th, Jon is actually the focus of the very first chapter of the book. Not to pat myself on the back, but the book has gotten a lot of praise for covering what the Wall Street Journal had to go through on September 11th in order to put out a paper. And again, Jon's the focus of that. But he was part of the Wall Street Journal team. Amazing, really was worth me writing a whole book about how they were able to put out a next day edition of the Wall Street Journal. So he is part of that. Among his educational credentials, he graduated from Duke University in 1989, was a Knight Bagehot Fellow, a prestigious fellowship at Columbia University, and actually has an MBA from the Columbia Business School. So you know a lot about economics, and I know you spent time in Hong Kong. You've worked from New York. You've worked from Washington. Where are you working from these days? You working from New York or suburban Washington?
Well, right now, as you watch me, I'm in my children's study at home, where they did all their homework as children. They've all now flown the coop.
Yes, they have.
So this is a much quieter place than it used to be. And Dean, I just want to say, first of all, thank you very much for having me. You are a friend. I also consider you a friend.
Thank you.
I really admire and appreciate the work you did on your book about the Wall Street Journal and 9/11. It's an important story, and I'm really grateful that you told it. And I'm also grateful that you're giving me a chance to talk to your listeners. It's an important audience, and I'm really looking forward to talking about this with you and through you to all your listeners and followers. So thanks.
Thank you, John. So let's start with the hard question that I actually warned you I was going to ask, and that is, many of my listeners, if not most of my listeners, are business owners. They own dry cleaning businesses. They own car washes, jewelry stores. They're not bankers. They don't work for stock firms. They're not in the financial segment. So for those people, why does a biography of Yellen, and we ought to also talk about the fact that although the book is called Yellen, there's an awful lot about her husband in there. Pronounce George's last name so I don't miss.
Akerlof, George Akerlof.
So he is a Nobel Prize, he shared it, winning economist. They are married. There's a lot in the book about George. But why, if I have a chain of restaurants, why do I care about Janet Yellen and her life and her policies?
Well, so Dean, I actually wrote the book with the restaurant owners and young women who are joining the workforce and people who are kind of experiencing the economy and trying to make sense of it in mind. It's really for those people. It's not for PhD economists or policy wonks. I mean, they'll get something out of it too. But I think every American really has experienced in the last 20 to 25 years a great deal of economic upheaval. And that phrase is in the subtitle for a reason, because what I'm trying to do in the book is to use Janet Yellen and her husband, George Akerlof, really as the narrative vehicle to explain and examine and explore this really turbulent time that this country has been through. You know, in the year 2000, as we entered the new millennium, we were going through this technology boom. The economy was roaring. Budget deficits had been eliminated. Inflation was very low. There was a great deal of hope in the United States that countries like Russia and China would follow our path and our model, and that this model of democratic capitalism would be the model for the world. And the last 20 years have been exceptionally turbulent, and I think exceptionally confusing to a lot of people, to business owners who, you know, from one year to another are dealing with a bank crisis, to an inflation crisis, to a health crisis, and trying to navigate all of this turbulence. And what I'm trying to do with the book is to tell the story of what happened, how we got here through the experiences of Yellen, in part because she was in the middle of a lot of the decision making and crises and crisis management. And so she becomes really a central character, and a character, you know, in part because she's the first woman who has ever run the Fed, has ever run the Treasury, the first human in U.S. history who's run the Fed, the Treasury, and the White House Council of Economic Advisors. I think she's a fascinating character. She's got a fascinating family. And so through their journey, I try to explore really in a nonpartisan way how we got here and how to make sense of it. I can keep going if you want. I mean, I'll just say the central lesson for me is that, you know, when you listen to the cable networks and read the newspapers and the newsways every day, there's so much political turbulence that clouds the story of what's happening in the American economy. And really the bottom line for me, having examined her story and everything around it, was that a lot of the problems that led us to where we are were human error. They weren't political error. They weren't partisan ideological error. There were just misjudgments that people made in different places and different points in time that caused turbulence that we're still living with today. The other thing I'd say is, to a certain extent, I think her family is a bit of an antidote to the madness you see in Washington these days, because despite the fact that she made mistakes like anyone else, and I examined them pretty thoroughly, this is a decent human being who was trying to do what was right. And she made some very good calls, and she also made some difficult calls, and I examine it. And I think by the end of the book, what I hope anyone will have is perspective on the turbulent times we live in, and some sense of, how to think about what could come next and how to navigate it.
Well said, John. What I do want to say is, and it's not because you're a friend. I want to say the book is engaging, and I don't want people to be put off by the fact that we're talking about the Fed or we're talking about the Treasury, because it's a good, solid read regardless. And as you said, it provides some perspective. You have been immersed in this for 25 years, for a quarter century.
Yeah.
I learned a lot. I'm a former Wall Street Journal reporter. I read the paper every day. I read multiple papers, but I still learned a lot. And I know that some of my listeners who are smart, savvy, successful business people could still use a little bit of a what is the when you're in college and you don't want to read the whole book, you buy the
Cliff Notes.
The Cliff Notes. So
we're dating ourselves, Dean.
Right. Well, now they call them something else. But here's what I wanted to read. This is from your book introduction. The Federal Reserve is the nation's central bank, charged with managing interest rates, containing inflation, and stamping out financial panics. The Treasury is charged with overseeing the tax system, the federal government's debt, and sanction programs aimed at adversaries abroad. Just to make it clear now, as you point out, she's been the head of both. And what you write in the introduction is that she emerged as the most powerful woman in American economic history, which is impressive. The subtitle of the book is The Trailblazing Economist. John, it doesn't have to be one thing, but is the trailblazing part of her biography the fact that she did emerge as the most powerful woman, that she overcame the glass ceilings that were in place, that this really was, much of this is an old boys network? Is that the trailblazing? Or were her policies actually a departure from things that have come before? Was she actually, if you ask Main Street people to name top economists, top Fed people, they'll talk about Milton Friedman, they'll talk about Paul Volcker, they'll talk about Alan Greenspan. Is Janet Yellen somebody who, in fact, was as much an original and as trailblazing in terms of her policy? Why trailblazing?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think for two reasons. And by the way, I'll say the subtitle is A Trailblazing Economist Who Navigated an Era of Upheaval. And that last part I think is important, because I just kind of want to hammer home the idea that this is a history book as much as it's a biography. It's a modern history book. So I think that's important. In terms of trailblazing, I think, it's twofold. One is, she is a woman who rose up in a very male-dominated field, and became the leading economist of her time, the longest-serving top policymaker in Washington. She's been in Washington since the mid-1990s. This wasn't an easy thing to do. There's an anecdote in the book that she did one of her early, early academic work at Harvard as an assistant professor. When she showed up at Harvard, just to give you a sense of what the world was like in the early 1970s, the school swimming pool was men only, and they swam naked in it. This was a much, much different world. And, women were just kind of not prominent figures in the field. So her voice, she had to, the story tells how a woman got where she did. And so part of the trailblazing story, I think that's important, is, I think there perhaps is a perception that there's this idea that women, in order to kind of make it in whatever male-dominated industry they might be in, have to lean in, have to speak up to have their voices heard. What struck me about Janet Yellen was that she's not a lean-in type of person. She's not going to pound the table. The story kind of tells how she got where she did with her own kind of internal resources. And those resources are kind of coming from pretty modest beginning in Brooklyn. She was just someone who was always determined to do her homework. She was always determined to get the answers right and to be more prepared than anybody else in a room. And I think that that's an important lesson, I think, for a lot of women out there, that you don't necessarily have to have the lean in mentality to get somewhere. You could be yourself and be that person in the best possible way. And then for her, this was, a modest person, but who outworked everybody else, and it got her where she was. That's one point about the Trailblazer. But the other point is that when things really got hairy, and they did get hairy during the financial crisis in 2007 and 2008, she had a lot of conviction, and she pushed the central bank as first as the sidekick to Ben Bernanke as his number two, in the face of a lot of internal resistance, to move forward with really aggressive policies to get the economy going again. And she really was a central character in rewriting the rules of modern central banking. And it's important to understand how those rules were rewritten and how they've been applied, really to understand what's happening in the world right now, in order to understand the inflation that we're experiencing right now. So, and this is where she played a really important role. So after the financial crisis in 2008, a lot of people were worried that the United States was going to go the way of Japan, that we were going to have bank failures, that we were going to have deflation, prices falling for a long period of time, excessive levels of debt. And she pushed the Fed to do aggressive policies to keep interest rates low. And it was those policies that kind of finally, after a very, very long decade that stretched from 2008 to 2018, got us back to a period where the economy was in pretty good shape, and got us to unemployment levels back under, when she left, unemployment levels back near and below 4% when she left the job of the Fed. But this is where the economic history comes in. So she was a trailblazer on monetary policy. But then we went into the COVID crisis, and this is where I talked earlier about how human error is really kind of so central to the economic experiences that we have. The Fed, after she left, we went into COVID, and they took those policies that were designed for a banking crisis and then applied them to a health crisis, to the COVID crisis. And they just did too much. They moved too aggressively. They used policies that worked in one context, and they didn't work in the next context. And I think that helps to explain where we are today. So she's been at the center of all of these debates. She did rewrite the rules of central banking. She was a central figure in doing that. But one of the lessons that we've learned in the last couple of years is that, like any doctor, you've got to use the right medication for the right disease. And one of the reasons we have inflation right now is that policymakers, including Yellen, Jerome Powell, both presidents, really, Biden and Trump, threw a lot of money at the COVID crisis, and it overstimulated the economy.
John, one thing that I have never understood, I never worked for the Washington Bureau, is how much credit any of these people actually deserve, or how much blame. How much can one individual really influence policy? Janet Yellen has to answer at a minimum to a president. She has to answer to potentially a Congress, which is a lot. I mean, in other words, not necessarily answer to them, but acting may require presidential approval. It may require congressional cooperation. If you're the Fed chair, there are regional heads of the Fed. I don't know, in Treasury, clearly a lot of department heads. So can one individual, and do you believe that Janet Yellen is an example of an individual who, through her knowledge and force of will and authority, actually does have the kind of impact on things like unemployment and inflation?
Yeah, I mean, I think these are people in powerful positions, and they do need to be held accountable. Uh, it's very often the case, I think, that when we talk about presidential elections, presidents tend to get more blame than they deserve when things are going poorly, and more credit than they deserve when things are going well. So I think that maxim does hold true. But at the same time, these are people with their hands on really powerful levers during really turbulent times. So I think that they do need to be held accountable. They do deserve credit for good decisions they make and blame for bad decisions they make. One of the things I like about Yellen is that unlike a lot of people in this town, she's acknowledged when she's made mistakes and actually apologized. That's really not the way Washington works, and I think that's one of the cool things about her. So there are a lot of forces at work driving the economy, but there's also, as I said earlier, human error. So like one of the lessons that comes out, I think, for me from writing this story and thinking about it a lot is the economics profession in and I go through all this in the book, in the 1980s and 1990s, spent a lot of time examining and thinking, well, how do markets work? There was a view that went back to Milton Friedman and the Chicago School, that viewed markets as being rational and efficient. And and Janet Yellen was part of a movement that said, well, wait a second. And so was her husband, George Akerlof. Wait a second. Markets aren't always so rational, and they're not always so efficient. Very often, they're just very basic human psychological errors that people make that make markets, the stock markets, go out of whack. So I'll give you one example. There's this idea of recency bias. So people have a human tendency to kind of overweight recent events when they make judgments about kind of what's going to happen next. They might say, well, the market's been going up. I'm just going to stay invested and keep investing because the market's going up and I want to stay in it. And so you have this recency bias to just kind of keep riding what you've been doing. And this is what economists like Yellen and George Akerlof uncovered about markets. But what I've discovered from writing this book is that the exact same thing can be said of policymakers. So, and it's recency bias, this behavioral psychological quirk in human nature, that really got us the inflation we're experiencing right now, because these easy money policies that the Fed did after the 2008 crisis didn't cause inflation. And Jerome Powell, Janet Yellen, first Donald Trump, then Joe Biden threw a lot of money at the economy thinking there wouldn't be inflation, and then we got it. So the same fallacies that affect markets and people's behavior in markets also affect the officials that have their hands on these great big levers, and they have to be aware of these problems and quirks if they're going to make good decisions on behalf of the American people.
Agreed. Let's talk a little bit about George Akerlof.
Okay.
He, I was trying to find my specific notes, but his sort of breakthrough had to do with asynchronous. What is the terminology he came up with?
Asymmetric information.
Asymmetric information, right?
So George Akerlof was part of a very small and gifted group of economists studying at MIT in the 1960s. It was a really fascinating group. It started with an economist named Paul Samuelson, who was this very gifted economist at Harvard in the 1940s. He wrote the breakthrough economic textbook, and he did a lot of work to kind of formalize in mathematical ways the ideas of John Maynard Keynes after the Great Depression. And Samuelson couldn't get a job at Harvard. Some people suspected it was because of anti-Semitism in the economics department. And he was offered a job down the road at an engineering school of all things at MIT. And he went down there, and a lot of top economists gravitated to him. And George Akerlof became one of those people in the 1960s. And Akerlof was being taught, a lot of very kind of conventional models and theory about how markets worked. And Akerlof just got to thinking, well, that's not the way humans behave. This idea that buyers meet sellers and supply meets demand and prices adjust in kind of smooth and efficient ways. And so he started looking at individual industries and markets to see if that was the case of what actually happened. And he started out by looking at used cars. Yeah. And what he discovered in used cars was not a world of efficiency, but a world of deceit and suspicion. So when you think about someone selling a used car, they might know that the belt on their attached to their flywheel is kind of dry and cracking and could break at any time, or that spokes on the flywheel are missing. And so they know what's going on inside that engine better than the buyer. And knowing the buyer, knowing that the seller knows something that he or she doesn't, becomes suspicious about why is this person even selling a car. And so what he found was very inefficient in the 1960s used car market. And he used that as the leaping off point to examine how people have different sets of information when they're in a marketplace that could affect their behavior and make them inefficient. Another good example is health insurance. So, if you're someone, you might have a pre-existing condition who decides you have to go out and double down on your health insurance, and the health insurance company might be suspicious about what you're bringing into the door. And, this led to a lot of real world changes in the way used car markets and health markets worked. But really at the core of his thinking, and this opened up really to a generation of economics that said, all right, wait, markets aren't always that efficient. His core idea was that underneath these markets, the unit of exchange is a human being, and that human beings behave in ways that are sometimes unpredictable and sometimes not all that rational or efficient. And I think that's something else that maybe your listeners can identify with as they think about managing not only their businesses, but also their investment portfolios.
In the talk a little bit about how maybe George influenced Janet's thinking on the world.
So this is where the love story comes in, and they have a pretty cool story. So as I mentioned, Janet Yellen got to Harvard. She was a star student at Yale under a guy named Jim Tobin in the 1960s. She got to Harvard. She didn't fit in. She was considered for tenure and rejected by Harvard. She tried to write an economics textbook with Tobin, and it didn't work out because the economics profession was changing in a lot of ways at the time that were being driven by the University of Chicago and its rational expectations views. And so she was kind of out in the job market and got an offer at the Fed. And, she was by then a woman in her early 30s. So her mother nagged her a lot to get married. And she had a view that she wasn't going to marry someone just for the sake of being married. She wanted to find the right partner. So she shows up at the Fed in the fall of 1977 after a series of failures. It just so happens George Akerlof had been through a series of failures too. He wrote that paper I mentioned about used cars. It was called The Market for Lemons,
Yeah.
which would go on to become a famous paper, but it was rejected the first three journals that he sent it to. And then he kind of was wandering to different places. He saw his wandering as a form of kind of exploration, but he spent time in India. He spent time in the Nixon Council of Economic Advisors, which was unusual because he's very much of a liberal Keynesian bent. He got married, went back to the University of Berkeley. His wife left him, and then he got rejected for a senior post at Berkeley, and he said, "I'm leaving again," and was on his way to London School of Economics, and said he had a very peripatetic kind of movements all over the place. And he said, "I'm going to go and spend a year at the Fed." So he and Yellen showed up at the Fed in the fall of 1977, and they fell in love overnight. They realized that they had very similar worldviews, that they saw in what they were doing, as geeky as it might be to all the rest of us. They saw some purpose and some higher purpose to what they were doing, because these were two people who grew up hearing stories about the Great Depression as children, hearing stories about the tragedy of unemployment, the loss not only of income but of dignity that came with it, the health problems it could cause, the social problems it could cause. And they both got into economics saying that they wanted to do work that kind of helped relieve the problem of unemployment. And Janet Yellen is this like exceptionally prepared person. She over prepares for everything. When she goes to the airport, she leaves 3 hours early. And she made one rash decision in her life, and that was a decision to marry George Akerlof. And they've been married since, let me see now, it would have been 1979, I guess. So I'll let you do the math.
She's 5 foot tall, roughly. She's roughly 5 foot tall. She's a petite woman.
Yeah, she's not the tallest person in the world. That's
and how tall is George?
Oh, he's not very big either. They in fact, there's a little anecdote in my story. They're not these kind of glamorous people who drive around town in black limousines. They used to putter around town here in Washington in their Toyota Camry, and you couldn't see their heads over the headrests. George is a guy in his mid 5 feet, I guess. Really interesting character, great sense of humor, very creative thinker. And he was creative in ways that she wasn't, and she was disciplined in ways that he wasn't. And so they did a lot of research together and did a lot of important academic work before she got called on to come to Washington in the mid-90s.
John, how much time did you spend with them, as either individually or as a couple, in prep for the book?
I spent a lot of time with them. Went out to Berkeley, spent some time with them on a vacation. Spent a bunch of time on the phone and video calls. I kind of felt at the outset of doing this story. I mean, I'd already known Yellen for some time, having covered her. I felt like to really understand her and get into her world, I needed to understand not only her husband, George, but also their son, Robbie, who became an economist himself. And for me, some of the most eye-opening lessons that I learned were lessons I learned by talking to Robbie and George about the work that they do. So there's a lot of kind of economic history in the book, and there's also a lot of theory. These guys are theorists who just kind of let their minds go into unexplored places. And George Akerlof had this way of like always being like 20 or 30 years ahead of the curve. Yeah. He was warning about inefficient markets decades before we had the stock bubble and then the mortgage bubble that followed it. And in fact, he won his Nobel Prize shortly after the stock bubble burst for work that he had done on inefficient markets. But what George and Robbie have been working on for the last couple of decades is trying to understand social division. Why is it that people tend to cluster in groups and set themselves against other groups? And it becomes a really important theme in the final quarter of the book, as we enter this period of red versus blue America and so much social division. And it turns out once again that George Akerlof had been examining that, and his son followed in his footsteps, became a theorist. And they came up with a lot of really interesting ideas that help explain why this country is so divided right now. So I spent a lot of time talking to them about that. I had some interesting opportunities to talk to Yellen in the middle of the Ukraine crisis when she had to design sanction programs against Russia in the middle of this inflation upsurge. So it was an interesting time and a learning experience, and they were pretty helpful.
I have to imagine, John, that having gone through the process of researching the book, getting to know Janet and George and their son, etc., that in some ways today you're a better reporter when it comes to covering economics and finance than you were before you started.
Well, I mean, I certainly think I got a lot of perspective on things,
Yeah.
and I was forced to think about things in ways that I hadn't thought about so much before. My tendency, just generally speaking, is not to be a partisan, not to paint people in kind of black and white perspectives. And I think this reinforced some of that. I mean, I think that there have been a lot of judgments and misjudgments made about economic policy over the last few years. I get into a lot of the debates that were held in the world of economics in the 70s and 80s about free markets and small government. And I'll tell you, I came away with this lesson, which I think is a really, for me, it's the central lesson of the story. And it's the thing I hope a lot of people come away thinking about more carefully. So there's this running debate throughout American history about this interplay between government involvement in the economy and free markets, between the Milton Friedmans who say that markets should rule and the John Maynard Keyneses who say that the governments have this critical role to play. And I think there's this balance that we as a nation have to strike between democratic government and market-driven capitalism. And I think coming out of the 1990s, after this economic boom, there was a sense of really hubris in the country and also enthusiasm that we had found the right balance and that the rest of the world was going to follow us. And one of the things that we've discovered in the last 20 years is the rest of the world is not necessarily going to follow us. That's striking that this balance between government, democratic government, and market-driven capitalism is fragile, and it depends on having institutions that work to keep it going, and to revive it and refresh it, and adapt as times change. And I think we need to have some humility as a country about these institutions and about taking care of them, because a lot of them have been damaged and challenged, and a lot of Americans today don't trust them anymore. They mistrust regulators, they mistrust banks, they mistrust a large part of the population now mistrusts our electoral system. Certainly they mistrust journalists. And we really, I think, if we want to preserve this delicate balance that our founders created, we got to be working at these institutions and working at strengthening them. And I think that transcends the political arguments about kind of markets versus government or Republican versus Democrat. I think everybody needs to be thinking about how do we strengthen these institutions, because it's just not a given that we get to keep the way this country runs. If you look at what happened to China and happened to Russia, it went in the other direction, and it's going to be tragic for a lot of people in those places.
So the book is on sale, pre-order now. If you want to get there, we've been running some things at the bottom of the screen, but for the audio listeners, you can go to tinyurl.com/MMR MMR for Monday Morning Radio, Yellen, Yellen. So tinyurl.com/MMR The book will be out. It will be physically in my hands November 1, but in many ways, John, the final chapter has yet to be written because Janet Yellen is still Secretary of the Treasury. We don't quite know what the final record is going to be on her administration this time.
Yeah, and so Dan, you have me thinking about my mom. There really is no final record, and my mom was a historian too, and she developed this theory, this idea that she had of a kaleidoscope, that history turns like a kaleidoscope, and the configurations are constantly changing and shifting. And there's always some new configuration growing out of where we are today. And it kind of takes an open mind to kind of see how these configurations are changing and to kind of see how this new world is unfolding in front of our eyes. Very few people in 2019 would have thought we'd be where we are today with so much debt and a health crisis and inflation. It's just unfathomable. This kaleidoscope is turning. And what I conclude in the book about Yellen, given where we are right now, is just like everybody else who I trace through in the book, whether it's Milton Friedman or Larry Summers or Ben Bernanke or Alan Greenspan, these are humans. And they make mistakes. And she's one too. She made some very good calls, but she's also made some tough ones. And the record, I think, is going to show that if nothing else, she was a public servant who was trying to do her best. One of my favorite quotes in the book was from the guy who fired her, Donald Trump, who decided not to give her a second term, said he really admired her. He respected her. He knew that she cared about our country. So, like or dislike her policies, at least I think we can come away with an idea that this was someone who's been trying to get it right.
So I was a little bit tongue-tied when we first started talking, and I couldn't find the word that I was looking for, but I found it. Okay. About the book Yellen, and it's in your writing, but no, maybe it's not yours, someplace else. But I think this will be a seminal book. That's the word. That's the word I was looking for. I think
now you're being too nice, Dean.
Okay, forget it. It won't be. No, I'm kidding. It really is impressive, and I think, John, I also think it sort of sets the stage for other journalists and authors in the future, in terms of how you can take a look at what can be a very complex topic, and economics is very complex, and how you can humanize it and make it relevant to a broader audience. I mean, I think you've done that in a way that I can't recall another book that has done it as well. And by the way, I went to Northwestern University as an undergraduate. Samuelson was the book I had to take in economics. And I don't want to tell you what grade I got in the course.
Well, you know what? I'll tell you. I got a C in economics as an undergraduate, and I came away thinking that maybe this is just arrogant in me, but I came away thinking they did a terrible job teaching the subject because they didn't teach it, and this was part Paul Samuelson's fault. They taught it as a bunch of lines and graphs and mathematical formulas, and I think part of the hubris of the economics profession was they really came to believe that they were managing this science that can be configured on a spreadsheet. And that's not the way I go about telling this book. I go about it telling as it's storytelling, it's people, it's ideas, and it's people putting those ideas to work. And I think the economics profession might have done itself a little better service if it had thought in those ways. And frankly, I think that George Akerlof did as they kind of navigated over these last 30 or 40 years. I do hope, Dean, that speaking of undergrads, I hope young people read this book. I hope they can see in it that this is a story that can be understood, and that in some ways it's a roadmap to navigating a very complicated world that we're all trying to get through and figure out how to position ourselves best in.
John, I think it's an excellent point. The book is from HarperCollins. Again, the title is Yellen, the Trailblazing Economist Who Navigated an Era of Upheaval. We're still in that era of upheaval. And so you'll have to come back. You're always welcome back. By the way, you mentioned your mom. I'm not going to go into there's some other interesting aspects of your life. I'm not going to go into them, but you do dedicate your book to your mother, Elaine, and
yes,
to your father, Joseph. And there's a story about both of them that one day we'll have you back and we will explain. But
wow, that's quite a teaser you left out there, Dean.
Well, you fill it in if you'd like to.
Google Joseph Hilsenrath, and you could read all about him in the Wall Street Journal.
Yes, you can. Yes, you can. Again, it's such a different topic, John, that's why I chose to leave it out for now. But it's something I'd love to revisit. So best of luck with this book. This video cast will be out before the book is officially available. But again, if people go to tinyurl.com/mmryellen, you can pre-order it. And it is something that not only should you read yourself, but if you have late teenagers, early 20s, good book to buy for them. They'll be able to read it because it's very readable, and good grounding. John, I think I just lost you. Okay, perfect time to lose you. Anyway, that is going to wrap it up for this week's special edition of the podcast. I thank Jon Hilsenrath for taking the time to be with me. Thank you, John.
Thank you so much, Dean.
Till next week, I'm your host, Dean Rotbart. Have a great week.